Welcome everyone who's signing on to today's webinar. We're a couple of minutes from getting started. Leave a note in the chat, let us know where you're from. We're glad you're with us, and we'll try to get started in a couple of minutes. So we have a lot of people posting. We have people from Sweden, Virginia, Florida, Long Island, Alan from Comic, Long Island, Chuck's neighborhood. People from Israel, England, Fairbanks, Alaska, welcome.
The Frozen Chosen.
New Jersey, Mexico, Seattle, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, another
Palmer, Alaska.
Palmer, Alaska, yeah.
I've been there.
Have you?
Yeah, I've been to Fairbanks.
Washington, Michigan, people in Los Angeles, people from all over the world are joining us today. For everyone who's logging in, welcome. We're about a minute away from getting started. And let us know in the chat where you're from. It's good to be with everybody. We have people from all over the world, in South Africa, England, another person from Long Island I see, in New York, San Francisco.
My old hometown.
I didn't know that.
Yep, lived there for 25 years.
We have a large number of Jewish Gen leadership in the Bay Area. We have Nancy Siegel, who's our Director of Communications, and Phyllis Berenson, who Chuck, as you know, is the Director of the Ukraine Research Division, and Vivian Kahn, the Hungarian Research Division. Brooke Gans sometimes is a longtime volunteer and consults for us. And we have a good representation out there. So welcome everybody. Welcome to everybody who's just logging in. We are at 2 o'clock, so we are going to get started. And my name is Avraham Grohl, and I'm privileged to serve as Executive Director of JewishGen, which is the largest resource for Jewish genealogy. We are an affiliate of New York's Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And we're glad that you're with us today for this talk by Chuck Weinstein that's going to talk about myths of Jewish genealogy. This is the first in a series of Jewish Gen talks, of webinars that will take place in the coming months. So please continue to watch your email and discussion group messages for information about what is to come. A couple of notes before we begin, as we always do. This session is being recorded and it will ultimately be on JewishGen's YouTube channel. And when we have the video live, we'll post a message on our discussion group. So as we always mention, if you're not on the JewishGen discussion group, you should be, and please register. Go to the JewishGen homepage and click on Connect, and you can get set up. The discussion group is an amazing, amazing resource where you can connect with thousands of people from around the world. You can seek research advice, you can post questions, you can share information that you have, share your own success, and notably, you can search through archives of messages going back to the late 90s. An incredible, incredible resource that I encourage all of you to take advantage of. There will be opportunities to ask questions in this webinar, to ask questions of Chuck. As we go along, post a question in the Q&A. It's on the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to as many questions as we possibly can, but we ask that you please leave your questions general in nature. We won't be able to go through and offer personal research assistance. So as a brief introduction of our speaker today, within the Jewish genealogy world, Chuck really needs no introduction, but Chuck is a towns coordinator for our Ukraine Research Division. He was the Jewish Gen Volunteer of the Year in 2019. He was the first Susan E. King Volunteer of the Year. And I'm going to post a link to the video about him in the chat and also include it in the follow-up email. He is the past president of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Long Island in New York, and he's the current vice president of the Genealogy Federation of Long Island in New York. Chuck has spoken at numerous conferences, both in the United States and around the world. He's a regular presenter at family history workshops for his local society in New York and Long Island. And his research has been ongoing for more than 3 decades. And he has provided and he has uncovered information about his family that goes back to the 17th century. So he is very well and a very appropriate person to guide us into getting started with genealogy and to go through the myths that people often encounter. So Chuck, thank you very much for being with us. I pass it over to you.
Thank you, Rami. And I want to update one thing because I did not send it off to you, but I just got contacted the other day by somebody that has developed research on my family now going back to the 14th century. So I'm like overwhelmed with a ton of information, and I'm checking the documentation. But it's amazing stuff. And all of this comes as a direct result of my involvement over the years with JewishGen, or a lot of it, I should say, because I get contacted by people through the JewishGen Family Finder. I get contacted by people through JewishGen that are, researching family lines similar to mine, or people that are actually looking for help in research. So I can't say enough about what JewishGen has done for me in terms of my own personal stuff. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. I want to talk to you today about the 3 great myths of Jewish genealogy. And this is a good beginner talk. And I'm going to tell you that, if you've been doing this for years, I don't know that you're going to come away with a whole lot of new information. But if you haven't been doing this for years, I've got some resources that I'll share with you as a basic starting point. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what you really need to know and do to research your own family history. So by way of introduction, the agenda today, we're going to talk about why Jewish genealogy in the first place. Why should I study my family history? I'm going to talk about the fact that every day that goes by, records are becoming more easy to find online. And when I say that, JewishGen is being now inundated with records that are coming in from Ukraine, and in particular, and other places in Europe. And we'll talk about how the databases are expanding exponentially, and that's also true with other resources that you can use. Talk about some additional sources of information, especially primarily for Jewish records. Talk about the 3 great myths. My favorite is the one that, it was a tiny little place that no longer exists, destroyed in the war. We'll talk about that. The Germans destroyed all the records, so there's nothing left there. I'm not going to find anything. Talk about that. And of course, everybody's favorite, the names were changed at Ellis Island. And that is probably one of the most prevalent myths in people's research. And I'll talk a little bit about how we can disprove that. I'm going to talk to you about some local resources that you can use in addition to that. And so the first question is, why Jewish genealogy? Why should I study my family history? What's in it for me, I guess? And so the Torah tells us to honor your father and your mother. Thy days be long in the land that I will show thee. And secondly, the Shoah had a huge impact. I thought for years, the Shoah doesn't impact me. I don't have any family that was in Europe during the war. So there's no impact. I have now documented about 85 cousins that I know of, and there are probably a lot more that I don't even know of, that were swept away in the Holocaust. So the Shoah is a way, first of all, for us to help reconnect families that were split apart by World War II. And this is a primary function of JewishGen too, is to help people find distant cousins that are still alive today that survived the Shoah, and provide them with information that, yes, indeed, you do have additional family. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. There are so many lost histories of families. And I mentioned before that I'm looking at a tree that goes way back. And it turns out that at least on one line, and this is a line that involves my paternal grandmother, that her family comes from a very long line of rabbis, something I had no idea of. Is it a good practical use? I'm not sure, but it's a wonderful thing to know, and we'll take it from there. It's important to keep Jewish culture alive. They've been trying for thousands of years to get rid of us, and I'm here to tell you that we're here to stay. So in order to understand both, where your parents came from and their stories, you have to know a little something about Jewish culture. And even if you're not particularly religious, you're not sending your kids to a religious school or what have you, there are some cultural things that are just widely accepted. Finally, one of my favorite points is that each of us is made up of 50% of stuff that we got from each parent. So there's a lot of nature that's involved in us, and certainly family history. And that family history, like I said, 50% from each parent. Each parent is made up of 50% of their parents, and so on up the line. So the further you go back in time and understand who your family was and where they came from and what they did and how they were, you'll know more about yourself. And that is also never a bad thing. So I said a few minutes ago that records are getting easier to find online. And this is very true today. More and more records are coming available. That is not to say that if you go online, you will find all the records that you need to trace back your family history. It's still hit or miss. There are millions and millions of records that are online. There are probably billions of records that have not yet been digitized and put online. So not everything that you need is available on the internet. Some of it, I'm afraid, if you want to do that research, you're going to have to go somewhere and find the information yourself. But JewishGen has a large selection of databases from various countries in Europe, a few in Asia, and a number of databases from the United States, all of which can help you to find the records for the place you're looking for. And if you go on the JewishGen homepage, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and you go under research, you can click into these research divisions. And if your family came from Lithuania, you might want to look more into the Litvak SIG, which is a separate organization from JewishGen, but they're hosted by JewishGen, and we work very closely together. Or the Ukraine Research Division, or the French Research Division, wherever your family came from, as far as you know. Ancestry is obviously a primary place to find records online. A lot of their Jewish records, not all of them, but a lot of their Jewish records actually came from a collaboration that we at JewishGen had with Ancestry for a few years back in the last decade. And so Ancestry agreed, as part of that collaboration, that those records would be available for viewing outside of their normal paywall. So you don't have to be a paid member of Ancestry to look at the JewishGen databases on Ancestry and actually look at what records are available. That having been said, there are an awful lot of records today that after the collaboration ended have been added to the JewishGen databases. So really the purpose of having the records and keeping the records on Ancestry is to sort of funnel you back to JewishGen and to be able to see what records are available on JewishGen. That having been said, I would certainly not put down the need to look at Ancestry. If you are not a paid member of Ancestry, you can still get access, at least here in the United States, if you live in a city where your local public library has access to Ancestry. And many public libraries around the country do. And it's a service that they offer. And as long as you have a library card, you can log in through your local library's website and actually have access to Ancestry in your home, at least through the end of this year. Ancestry began offering that access at the beginning of COVID. They've extended it a few times. And again, the last extension goes through the end of this year. We'll see if they decide to extend it further or they're going to stop doing that. But you do have access to the library edition of Ancestry at home. Again, if you live in the United States or someplace else that has access to Ancestry through your local library. The Ellis Island Foundation, of course, maintains the passenger manifests for people who arrived at Ellis Island between 1891 and 1957. And those passenger manifests are available through the Ellis Island Foundation. Ancestry has the same manifests, so does Family Search. Each of them has a different set of indexes. So if you're looking for your ancestor, you have to understand that the passenger manifests were all written at the time that your ancestor bought their steamship ticket somewhere in Europe. And the quality of the handwriting on those depends on the clerk who wrote them down. Some of them are very difficult to decipher. And so you may have a better time finding your ancestor on Ancestry than Ellis Island or vice versa, depending on who it was that was trying to look at that listing on the manifest and deciphering the handwriting and then putting it into a database. So I will tell you that none of these databases are perfect. The indexes are only as good as the indexer's understanding of the handwriting of the people who wrote the records. They're all in cursive. Some of them are quite beautiful, and some of them, well, I think they must have been written by physicians. And maybe we should find some pharmacists who can help us decipher them. The National Archives in the United States, NARA, has a lot of genealogical records on their website. They have far more at their 12 locations scattered around the country. If you can't find the documents that you're looking for on the website, you can go to a National Archives location, hopefully near you, and either be able to view the records on a computer or microfilm, or find out where they can be viewed. These records will include all of the US censuses from 1790 through 1940, except for the 1890 census, most of which was destroyed in a fire back in 1921. So we have other aids for finding people that would be in the 1890 census, but for the fact that those records were burned. NARA also has various pension records from military sources. They have a lot of military records. They have just about everything that government has collected in the way of the paper trail that our ancestors left. And they are available through National Archives and their website. Yet another one that is very good too is Family Search. I'll talk a little bit more about them later, but they also have a lot of records online, some of which you need to go to your local family history center to view, some of which you can actually view from the comfort of your living room. So some of the sources of information are going to be based on where did your ancestor live? JRI Poland is, again, a separate organization. It is not directly affiliated with JewishGen. They have their own board of directors. They have their own membership. But JRI Poland has done a wonderful job of working out an arrangement with the Polish State Archives to get tons of Polish records available online with links that you can click on to order a copy of the original record without having to sit down and write a letter in Polish and figure all of that out. They are a wonderful resource if your ancestor comes from the area that is today Poland and was not part of Galicia back prior to World War I. They have some records from Galicia. They have some records that are from places in today's Ukraine and Belarus and Lithuania. But most of their records cover most of the rest of what we would consider modern day Poland. Litvak Sig covers records specifically from the Russian Empire gubernias that were combined to create the nation of Lithuania, both between the wars and after 1991, when Lithuania broke away from the former Soviet Union. Litvak Sig has birth, marriage, and death records going back well into the 19th century for most of the towns of modern-day Lithuania. And Litvak Sig has done an amazing job of both indexing those records and providing the indexes and giving you a way to contact the National State Archives in Lithuania for those records. Gesher Galicia is another independent organization. Gesher Galicia also works very closely with JewishGen. And Gesher Galicia covers the part of Central Europe, I guess, which makes up Western Ukraine today. And it also makes up parts of what are now Poland, parts of what are now Hungary, and a large chunk of what is now Slovakia. So those records can be accessed through Gesher Galicia. And again, they can help you get a hold of the copies of the original records to maintain as your documentation. I would certainly be remiss if I didn't mention JewishGen's databases. JewishGen has well over 1 million records, birth, marriage, and death records from all over the world. For the most part, they are indexes. The indexes can refer to records that are on Family Search, that are on other databases, and they generally will provide you with a way to actually view the actual record itself. JewishGen does not post the actual records online. We don't have those agreements with the various repositories that these records originally came from. But if you are looking for records from a specific area, you definitely check with the JewishGen databases. And as I mentioned before, when JewishGen had a collaboration agreement with Ancestry, the records from a lot of these databases were offered up to Ancestry with the proviso that they will always stay outside of Ancestry's paywall, and they still are today, but they'll refer you back to JewishGen for the most part. Ancestry has a major European collection on their own. They're not obviously just not Jewish records, they're records of every ethnic and every culture that is part of Europe today. It's a huge collection. And again, for the most part, you may get lucky, you may actually be able to see a record, or Ancestry will tell you where you can find it. And that's a great finding aid. The Israeli Genealogical Research Association maintains a huge database of records, primarily from the Mandate era between 1918 and 1949. These are records, in many cases, are written in English, which is very helpful. I've always complained, and I was talking with Abrami about this earlier, I've always complained that most of these repositories hold records that the people who made those records didn't have the courtesy to write them in English for us. So if you see the original record, it's going to be in whatever the language at the time was. And that is true of a lot of the, certainly all the Eastern European countries. But IGRA, the Israeli Genealogical Research Association, has in their databases an awful lot of records that are in English, and they can also help you get the records or find out who to contact in Israel to find records for people that emigrated to Palestine, for people that have in more modern times moved to Israel, perhaps after the war, and so forth. Also in Jerusalem, we have the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People. They have been filming records in the former Soviet Union for the last several years, and they maintain databases. They do not do research. You actually have to go to Israel if you want to see the records. But they can tell you whether or not, through contacting them, whether your town records have been filmed and whether they have them in their system. It's a really interesting place to get information, and maybe it's a good excuse to go and visit Israel. Finally, we have the family history centers. Every Mormon church around the world has family history center attached to it. I shouldn't say every, but most of them do. Have a family history center attached to them. Now, the family history centers were all closed at the beginning of the COVID outbreak. Some of them have yet to reopen. They are all manned by volunteers, not all of whom are Mormon. They do not proselytize. They don't try to convert you to Mormonism. It's not forbidden to go in there. And they're generally very helpful and very useful about getting you records that you may not be able to find anywhere else. All of that having been said, you need to contact your local Mormon temple if you have one and find out if their family history center is currently open and what the hours are. As I say, they're all run by volunteers, so the hours are often quite spotty, but they do have specific hours that they publish when they're open. And it's a good place to start. I've done a lot of research there. I've found an awful lot of information in family history centers over the years. So let's talk about the three great myths. Well, the first one, it's a tiny little place that no longer exists. So your grandfather, Zadie or Bubby or whoever, remembers a town name that is not found on any map that you can find today. Well, that's true. However, they probably know the town under a different name. The towns are still there. There were only 3 towns in all of Europe that were destroyed during World War II completely and no longer exist. And none of them had any significant Jewish population to begin with. So the town is still there. It may not have any Jews left in it, or it may have very few, but trust me, it's still there. And it may be under a different name because towns had names depending on, first of all, who was running the place at the time. At my JGS, the Jewish Genealogy Society of Long Island, we had a speaker several years ago who recalled that her mother told her a story that when she was very young, she would look out the window to the local post office to see what flag was flying over it so they knew who was in charge that day. There were a lot of border changes. There were border shifts. So towns might have a German name, a Russian name, a Lithuanian name, a Polish name, you name it. Whatever languages were spoken in that part of the world at various times, or whatever governments ruled various areas at various times, the town names changed. Well, the JewishGen Town Finder is a wonderful resource. You can enter that Yiddish name and ask to find a town that has that name. You may find that the town as it appears on the map today has absolutely nothing to do with that name, because that's probably in most cases a Yiddish name. But the Town Finder the database actually searches through all the different names in the history of that town to find out what it is today. And then you can look it up on a map and see where it is. So the town was not destroyed in the war. The most recent version of Where Once We Walked, it's a wonderful gazetteer. It's a resource for Jewish towns and villages throughout Eastern Europe. Written by Gary Makatoff and Sally Ann Anders-Sack-Pikus. The most recent version of it was last done in 2004. And it is a gazetteer. So you can look up, again, by any name that you know the town from, and it will tell you what the name of the town is today. If you go to that town's entry, it will tell you what the Jewish population of that place was between the wars and various resources that had information about that town. It is not designed to specifically give you, where did Bubby live in that town? What it will tell you is where that town is today. And again, you can find it on Google Maps or any other mapping source that you're happy to work with. I mentioned Google Maps because JewishGen uses Google Maps. An awful lot of people use Google Maps to find places. You have to know where the place was or what it's called today. Google Maps will do a wonderful job, if you know what it's called today, of showing you either a map of the area, and you can zoom in on it all the way down to street level, or a satellite view of the area so you can see what the geography and all of that is of the area around the town where your family came from. Is it on a river? Is it in the forest? Is it in the mountains? You know, so on and so forth. Google Maps is a wonderful resource to help you, again, understand where they lived and what they did in their lives in those places. Again, as I said, there's so many different names. The Yiddish name oftentimes is very similar to the German name, but not necessarily. And so as a result of that, if you want to find where the town is today, you need to use one of the resources I mentioned before to find it, because there are no towns left in Eastern Europe that are known by anybody currently under the Yiddish names that were used by the people who lived there prior to World War II. And so that's why Zadie said the town no longer exists. Well, the town doesn't exist maybe as a Jewish town, but it definitely still exists, and it's there on the map. If you are come from a Sephardic background, and I certainly don't want to minimize the importance of that. Again, for Sephardim, the JewishGen Town Finder has a number of towns of interest to Sephardim. There's also Sephardic SIG, which is, again, a separate organization, separate from JewishGen. They have a lot more information on where people settled. The Sephardim are descendants generally of the people who were expelled from Spain and Portugal in the latter years of the 15th century. And they spread out all around the Mediterranean. They spread into Syria. Many of them spread into Eastern Europe. And so it's not uncommon to find somebody whose family has lived in Belarus for 300 or 400 or 500 years that are actually descended from Sephardim and still follow some of the Sephardic religious rites, which are a little bit different. I don't have time today to go through that. But again, it's part of understanding Jewish culture. So the second of the three great myths, the Germans destroyed the records. Again, it's one that is very widespread and widely believed. Many of you know people who are called Yekis. Yekis are descended from German Jews. They tend to be very analytical people. They tend to be rather rigid, and they tend not to throw away anything. And that's true of Germans as well. That's part of German culture. And so the Germans did not destroy a lot of records. In fact, they kept so many records that we used a lot of them to hang a lot of them at the end of World War II. The German archives were captured by the British, fortunately, at the end of the war. The Allies then sat down and said, well, what do we do with this? We have the entire German archives, all the records from World War II. And as I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes, there were millions of them. And so they established a place at a city or town in central Germany called Bad Arolsen. Bad Arolsen, before the war, was the complex there was an SS training base, so this seemed like a very appropriate repurposing of the property. And most importantly, from the British, American, Russian standpoint, the infrastructure at Bad Arolsen wasn't destroyed because the place was never bombed. So there were radio towers intact, there were telephone lines intact, and all of that made it easier for communication. The Allies, again, used a lot of those records at the Nuremberg trials and other trials of Nazi war criminals, and those records still exist today. Under an agreement made in the year 2007, there is a repository for all of those records in each of the 11 countries that signed on to an agreement, and that includes the United States, where they are at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, Israel, which holds all those records now at Yad Vashem, and many other countries around the world. Those records are also now coming online. They have not been completely put online, but you can get into that. If you've had experience trying to trace a family member who disappeared during the war and had sent to Bad Arolsen through the International Tracing Service, trying to find that individual only to be told that there's no record of that individual, you might want to try again, because the records that were at Bad Arolsen that the ITC searched through to try and find your relative were based on the German spelling of everything, and there was no attempt made to find out if there were alternate spellings or something close. You can go online now and do what we call a fuzzy search, where you can put in some basic search terms and a soundex. There are a whole lot more relatives that are suddenly going to pop up that weren't available a few years ago. Many of the Eastern European countries, their archives are intact. They are saved. Even Lithuania, and it's a fun story for Lithuania, they believe that their archives were missing. They had no records from before World War II. In fact, they had no records from before the Soviet era. So when the Russians pulled out of Lithuania, the Lithuanian government was faced with a problem. We don't know what we have. We don't know where our natural resources are, what they are, how they are being used or exploited, and so on and so forth. So they hired engineers to try and figure these things out. And a group of engineers going through an abandoned salt mine stumbled on the entire Lithuanian archives, which, as we know now, had been spirited away by the employees of the Lithuanian State Archives in 1940 during the brief period of time between the signing of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact and the German invasion of Lithuania. They took all those records and moved them into a salt mine for their protection. They had a feeling that those records might disappear. Unfortunately, all the people who were involved in that died or disappeared during the war. And so it was not until 1994 that those records were accidentally discovered. But it's a fairly complete archive, and they have a lot of birth, marriage, and death records from around Lithuania. I mentioned the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People. They have a lot of records from World War II. And of course, the Mormons have a huge number of records that they film. Genealogy is part of their theology. And so it's very important to them to gain records. And they have a ton of them from all over Eastern Europe. And other sources include Yad Vashem, which has, of course, for Holocaust records, they're unparalleled. They do have their pages of testimony. So if your relative died during the war, somebody may have made a page of testimony for them after the war, and those pages of testimony are available. What you are looking at here, this is from some of the Bad Arolsen records. This is actually a transport list that was all nice and neatly typed. All of these people were sent on a train to a place called Auschwitz, which you may have heard of, but it lists their name, their occupation, and what city or what town they came from. Very detailed record. This is a death record from the Theresienstadt ghetto in Czechoslovakia. I never understood why they have these records to begin with, but they did have a need to keep records of everybody who died at Theresian, which was not a death camp, but an awful lot of people died there. As you see down in about the middle of the record, you see where they wrote in marasmus pneumonia was the cause of death for this particular individual. That may or may not be true. A lot of people were shot or hanged or otherwise done away with for violating various rules in the camp and such, and they created a cause of death for each of them. Fascinating. I don't know why they kept them, but they did. And these are available, again, through the Bad Arolsen records, and they're also available if you go to Theresien's website. This is a transport card from Theresien to, in this case, Auschwitz, for an engineer whose name was Karel Jokel. He comes from, he was deported originally from Brno in Moravia, and was transported in 1944 to Auschwitz, where he presumably perished. So he arrived at Theresien on the 28th rather of January in 1942 from Brno. He stayed there until October 16th in 1944. What you are looking at here is a ledger book of Russian birth records. These are actually from Ukraine. We are getting just more and more of these, but they have a great deal of information. There's a gentleman named Alex Krakovsky. Alex lives in Kiev, and he has, for the last several years, been filming these books at various archives in Ukraine and putting them online. And the Ukraine Research Division is downloading all of these. We are looking for volunteers to help us index them. So if you are interested in that, contact the Ukraine Research Division. The last great myth, the name was changed at Ellis Island. Well, yeah, everybody believes that. This is a copy of a passenger manifest. And these manifests were filled out in Europe. They were not filled out at Ellis Island. So the information is the name of the person as it was at the time that he or she bought a ticket to the United States. And it has information depending on the year of what town they came from. In some cases, who their nearest relative is in that place, remaining in that place, and where they were going, their occupation, and other information that it's fascinating to find out about your ancestors. This is a more modern passenger record. The first one that I showed you was from the early 1870s. This one is from 1906. And again, they're fairly easy to read. You notice they were stamped admitted on the side. If there's an X by them, they were held for some investigation. They may have thought that they were likely to become a public charge, or they didn't speak English and there was nobody there to come and get them at the time that the manifest was checked out. Subsequently, somebody showed up, a relative, a friend, to come and accept them. Getting into the United States in that period of time was very easy. As long as you weren't a communist, a polygamist, or had intentions of overthrowing the US government and could pass a very simple physical exam, you were in. Didn't matter anything else. Later on, the rules changed. Finally, I want to talk about the Shoah Victims Names Project, Names Recovery Project. This is from Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem has been working for years to create these pages of testimony. If you know information about an individual who was involved in the Shoah, whether they survived or whether they didn't, Yad Vashem wants to collect them. They want to give names, first of all, obviously, to the 6 million. 6 million seems like an awful lot of people, but when you break them down one by one, it becomes a whole different matter. So the pages of testimony, they ask for information on the individual, his or her spouse, where they were born, where they were living at the beginning of the war, and if known, where they were deported to and what happened to them. And so they're building this project. It's been ongoing for years. You can contact Yad Vashem online and let them know that you are interested in being a part of this project, and they will be very happy to send you the paperwork that you need to fill out about as many members of your family as you can do. You know, the problem is, of course, that survivors of the Holocaust are getting fewer and fewer in number. And so it's so important to get as much information available for future researchers as we can now, because we won't have much more time to collect that from living witnesses. And so they urge you to participate in that. So with that, I would like to end by saying that it's not as hard as it looks to find your family. It may be very interesting, and in any event, it will be of use both to you, your grandchildren, and generations yet to come. Your children may not care, and there are all sorts of things that you can find on JewishGen's discussion group archives from people who say, I have all this stuff that I've collected over the years and nobody wants them. What should I do with them? There are a lot of suggestions. There are many Jewish historical libraries and such that would be more than happy to take your materials. Again, your children and grandchildren and so on will be very thankful. A couple of quick projects I need to mention. Kahila Links at JewishGen allows you to put up and commemorate the places where your ancestors live, and to put up information, including pictures, stories, documents, whatever you have of that town. If there's already a Kahila Links page for the towns that your family came from, you can contact the person who put up that page, and they may be willing to add your information to the page. JewishGen also has a Yizkor book translation project in which we are trying to get all of the 1,400 or so known Yizkor books in the world. These are books that were created after the war by survivors who got together and put their collective memories together to write down what they knew about individuals in the town, the history of Jews in the town, and what happened during the war to them. And all of them, or most of them, I should say, include a necrology at the end, a list of all the Jews who lived in the town who died during the war. Now, these books were written generally in Russian, Polish, and/or Hebrew or Yiddish. So they're not available for the most part in English. What we're trying to do is make translations available so that people can read them and follow along with them. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Avrami, because it appears that we have a few questions that people are asking. Avrami, go ahead.
Chuck, thank you. This was really wonderful, very interesting and enlightening. So people have been posting in the Q&A and in the chat. Thanks everyone for your participation. A couple of notes to what Chuck just said. You can check on JewishGen on the homepage for links to the various resources and databases that we have. So if you're interested to see what Yizkor books we've translated or what towns we have a Kahila Links page for, visit the homepage and there's links where you can jump off to all of those resources and databases. I also want to mention that when it comes to Holocaust research, we have the Holocaust database. And we also shouldn't forget about our burial registry called JOBR, JOWBR, which now has surpassed 4.1 million records, which are incredibly valuable in trying to locate relatives, which you may not otherwise have found records for. So Chuck, a number of questions. The first one has to do with towns. If somebody doesn't know how to spell the name of the town where they came from, or is unsure where that town is because the geography, there was different people in charge at different points in time, how would somebody go about doing that?
Well, probably the easiest way is to use the either the JewishGen Town Finder or the JewishGen Gazetteer. Both of these are databases that list the towns with their various names, and you have the choice between spelling it the way it would have been spelled, or using what's called a soundex. And the soundex will actually give you a list of towns based on the pronunciation. Now, sometimes that's really useful because you have a Yiddish name for the town, that's all you know. You have no idea exactly how it's spelled in English, you know, kind of what it sounds like. And you can write that in, and it will give you a list of towns that were known by names that are similar. You know, that having been said, the only issue with that is that the Hebrew names or the Yiddish names of some of these towns may have been used an awful lot with different towns. The same is true with the German name or the Russian name. I see all the time on the Jewish Gen discussion group. My family came from a town called Neustadt. Where is that? Well, there are, Neustadt is as popular a name in Eastern Europe as Newark. So in the United States, there are 13 cities named Newark, including Newark, Delaware. And so if all I know is that they came from Newark in the United States, I'm kind of at a little bit of a handicap. If we can narrow it down a little bit more, that helps. But you may have to look through a number of Newark records trying to find the right Newark. That having been said, the other thing you can do is enter the information that you know in the Jewish Gen Family Finder. And I find that to be a wonderful resource. It has connected me with a lot of people in my family or doing research on people that are in my family that know more than I do about certain aspects of family members. And generally, for the most part, researchers on the Family Finder should be happy to help. Yeah, all of that having been said, there are an awful lot of people who sign in once, look around, no, I don't see any of my family here. I'm out of here. We never hear from them again. But there are an awful lot of people who are relatively active within the Jewish Gen. Currently, the Family Finder has about 600,000 researchers listed. And many of them are researching 10, 15 different family names and family towns. And again, the Jewish Gen Town Finder or the Gazetteer will help you figure out the towns.
Thank you. And to your point about the Family Finder, I'll just mention that in addition to you finding other people who might be searching the same information you are, you can also be found many years later as well. So there's a tremendous value if you go in and take just 2 minutes of time and register your own information, say who you are and who you're looking for. And then even if you never come back, which of course we want you to, and we're always adding new content and information, but even if you said that's it, and I'm not going to be a regular user, someone 2 years from now might come on Jewish Gen looking for family and might find you. So it's a really, really valuable resource. That's the Jewish Gen Family Finder. You can find that on the homepage. A couple other points. Somebody asked a question with regards to Yizkor books, Chuck, that you mentioned. What if there's no current translation of a Yizkor book? Can someone pay for it? The answer is yes. We are trying to translate as many books as possible, but as the questioner surmised, it really costs a lot of money to do this. We hire a team. We have a team of professional translators. Translating Yizkor books are not simple because they weren't written by one person. They were written by various people, generally survivors in the immediate decades after the war. And you have to understand where they were coming from, what regions it was, what the vernacular was, what some of the common expressions and terms would have been. So it does cost a lot of money. If anybody is interested in helping to support or to fund a translation of the Yizkor book, it would be appreciated. And you can reach out to me, or you can go on the website and you could see the list of funds that are currently ongoing or projects ongoing, or you could reach out to Lance Ackerfeld to talk about a specific project. I'll also use this as a plug to talk about our fall appeal, which is happening now, which is to help support our general operating fund. That fuels everything that you see on Jewish Gen, all the databases, all the resources, all the networking tools, and the informational components. And so if you're in a position to do so, and if you haven't already, we would greatly appreciate your support. But I will mention that you are under no obligation to do so. And sometimes people think that you must donate to Jewish Gen in order to utilize it. That's not the case. We believe very strongly in our mission that we should make this data and information available to anybody who seeks to learn about their family. We will always make this information available at no charge. And so we encourage you to please, continue to use it and share this information within your own networks and communities to let people know that this exists. So Chuck, there's a question that somebody was searching on records. You mentioned the Ellis Island database and they find a ship manifest, or maybe they were on Ancestry and they find a census record here in the United States. And it says that the family or the individual came from Russia. And that kind of is throwing everybody off because they're not exactly sure where that town is today. Can you shed some light on why it always says Russia?
Well, a lot of people just, it's kind of the same reason why I live in a town called Bellport, New York, which is on Long Island. But I was on my vacation this summer in Iceland, and people said, "Where are you from?" I said, "New York," because if I said Bellport, they would have no idea what I was talking about. So your immigrant ancestors, a lot of them said Russia, or it appears on the census place of birth, Russia. Well, that doesn't help. The Russian Empire of prior to World War I encompasses an area that covers 9 different countries today, mostly in what was known back then as the Pale of Settlement. So we have to get a little more specific. One of the great record sets, the National Archives and Records Administration, is records of naturalization. If they filed paperwork to become a citizen or ultimately became a US citizen, one of the questions that would appear on the form, at least after 1906, was, I was born in the town of blank in blank country. And, I would go ahead and tell people that, we have a name here of a town. Let's find the town, and that will give us an idea of where it is today. And so as a result of that, that would be a great way to break down that Russia thing. Another thing that Ancestry has, and I think Fold 3 has as well, are World War I and World War II draft cards. And again, they generally put down the name of the town that they were born in on those draft cards as they filled them out. So if they were old enough to be drafted in World War I, or they were either young enough in World War II for the regular draft or old enough in World War II for what was called the old man's draft, which are people that were born from 1876 to about 1910, you can find that record, you find the draft card, and it says right on it, I was born in, Kiev, Russia. And Kiev, by the way, comes with about 15 different spellings with various permutations. But again, you enter it into the town finder, and there's only one Kiev. So even if it's K-I-E-F-F, which I've seen, it's still today K-Y-I-V, Ukraine.
We're running towards the end, but for the last question, DNA is a very popular topic, and we will be running a series of 4 webinars on the topic of DNA in December, including a talk from Chuck Weinstein, who will talk about DNA for adoptees, or how instead of a bicycle, he got a sister for his birthday. So please stay tuned for that. But maybe, Chuck, maybe you could just give us 30-second overview of what value there is in using DNA and genetic research when it comes to this type of work.
Well, one of the things that we certainly find as we research is we come into a lot of dead ends, especially in doing Holocaust research. There are not records on everybody from World War II. There are a lot of people that were taken out in the forest and shot with no records being made of who they were or where they came from. And so the family just kind of, the family line ends. But there were survivors of these actions, and some of them are alive today, or their descendants are certainly alive. DNA will help you reunite with those descendants. And I think that's the most important thing. Certainly, if you are adopted or, were adopted at birth and you really know nothing about your parents, what DNA can help you do, as I will explain in the talk, is potentially find out who they were, where they lived, what they did, whether in fact they were Jewish or not Jewish. And, there's a lot of information that's available through DNA. We are all connected to our relatives in some fashion through DNA. One other thing I want to mention before you end this, if you have questions that, I'm not going to do, I can't do research for you. I can maybe point you in a direction. But if you want to drop me an email at chuck1, the number 1, at outlook.com, I'll answer you back. Again, if I can give you a simple answer, I will give it to you. I'm not going to be able to tell you, my bubby said on all the records that she was born in Russia. Where do you think she could have been born? I can't do that research for you. You're either going to need to try and figure it out yourself or hire a researcher. But I am happy to answer questions, and I'll definitely respond. I may not be able to answer your question, but I'll do what I can. So it's Chuck, CHUCK1 @outlook.com.
Thank you, Chuck. That's very generous of you. And I would encourage everyone to take advantage of that opportunity, but also to not inundate Chuck. Use the discussion group. It is a tremendous resource that Chuck checks so that you can post
every day. I use that.
Exactly. It is an amazing resource. So please consider using the discussion group. Look through the archives, as Chuck mentioned, see if anybody has talked about what it is that you're interested in. It's a tremendous, tremendous opportunity. I want to mention also that Chuck is a volunteer for JewishGen. He's involved in many different components, as we mentioned, on the Ukraine Research Division, on the Kahila Link site. He's been involved from JewishGen from the very beginning. He was the very first recipient of the Susan E. King Volunteer Award, recognizing that he goes back with Susan King when they first started the organization. And most everything that you see at JewishGen is fueled by volunteers like Chuck. So when you're posting on the discussion group, or if you're emailing Chuck directly, you can say thank you to them and recognize what they're doing. But also please bear in mind that these are volunteers who are giving of themselves on their own time. And we should appreciate that and recognize the time that they put into it. So Chuck, we thank you very much. Thanks for this great presentation. People are writing in the chat that even though they've been doing this for 10 years, they still learn things. And so thank you. Before we end, I'll just mention that this is the first in a number of JewishGen talks that are going to be taking place over the next few months. Next week on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern time, at the same time that it was today, we will have a talk focusing on Jews and researching Jews in the U.S. military. This is part of our ongoing series of researching families in the United States. So please register. You can visit our website, JewishGen.org/live, and you can register today. This session is recorded. We'll post a message on the discussion group as soon as it is live. So Chuck, thank you again. Thank you all of you from around the world who joined us, and we wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.